Imagine standing on a massive oil rig in the middle of the ocean when, without warning, explosions erupt around you. Metal groans, alarms blare, and the water below, your only escape, boils with flames. One by one, safety measures fail, each decision made long before this moment sealing your fate. And as chaos unfolds, those responsible are far from the disaster, watching from the safety of boardrooms ashore, their pockets lined while lives are lost. Money, it's the root of all evil.
You're listening to the Evil Money Podcast.
I'm Hannah.
And I'm James.
And we're here for you every Thursday, breaking down cases that meet at the intersection of money and morality. Today, I want to talk to you about the biggest oil spill disaster in all of history, known as Deepwater Horizon, or at least that's what the oil rig was called. What do you know about this case?
What I know is, I know that it was a huge disaster. Was it BP?
Yeah, BP.
Yeah, BP. That's pretty much all that I know, is that it was a huge oil disaster. It resulted in a lot of oil being in the ocean, which cost a lot of money to clean up. Huge disaster for the wildlife.
So that about sums it up, but I'm going to break down preceding events culminating in this disaster, what happened during the disaster, and lasting effects afterwards, so we can get a really good understanding of what went wrong, how did money have a play in it, and what can we learn from this disaster and hopefully avoid in the future. There's a lot of technical jargon in this episode, and I apologize for that. I think you'll enjoy it.
Yeah, I'll be fine.
Your technical jargon is right up your alley. For other people listening, I tried to dumb it down as best as I could. I am not a technical person either, so a lot of these words went over my head, but I think for the most part, the theory of what we explain is going to make sense. So to kick off, Deepwater Horizon was an ultra-deep-water, dynamically positioned, semi-submersible offshore drilling rig owned by R&B Falcon, which was eventually acquired by a company called Transocean. Transocean is a big player in this case. Transocean was formerly based in Switzerland for tax purposes,
Of course.
side eye, but it ran its Gulf of Mexico, yes, we're calling it the Gulf of Mexico. It ran its Gulf of Mexico operations out of offices in Houston. Their corporate motto was, quote, "We're never out of our depth." While the Horizon, as I'll call her that for the rest of this case, was owned by Transocean, it had been leased by BP, the massive oil company, for several years, including in 2010 when this disaster occurred. So basically, it was renting an oil rig. To lease the Horizon in 2003, it was willing to pay $350,000 a day for the bare rig, an amount that would only grow over the year to $500,000 a day by 2010. $500,000 a day.
That is crazy for rent.
Yep, but to BP, it was worth it. In 2000, they logged annual revenue of $148 billion, which would double over the next decade. So they could afford it.
Yeah.
But back to the Horizon. This ship was huge. To give you a sense, it was 395 feet tall, the equivalent of a 40-story skyscraper. The rig itself floated just above the ocean's surface, thanks to two long pontoons, each twice the size of a 727's fuselage, that would fill or empty with air and water at precise increments to lower or raise the main deck as high as 100 feet above the water or 60 feet when it needed a more stable base to drill. So it was kind of cool. It would go up and down and fill up with water and air. The rig could also move. It was dynamically positioned. It had 8 7,000 horsepower electric thrusters mounted beneath each pontoon. So it literally went from Asia to the Gulf of Mexico where it was built. It traveled there. It had 4 massive support columns supporting an Eiffel Tower-like oil derrick, which rose 260 feet above the rig's deck from a 48-foot square base. The rig had 2 cranes built in on either side of the derrick to transfer steel pipe and other heavy equipment used in well drilling from supply boats to what was known as the rig floor, a platform surrounding the derrick, one level above the main deck. Beneath the deck was something called the accommodation block, basically a 2-level hotel and office building where the crew on board had cabins, conference rooms, offices, a kitchen, dining hall, movie theater, gymnasium, infirmary, and a lounge. It was like a hotel.
Yeah, that sounds pretty nice to me.
The rig could comfortably house, feed, and entertain about 126 workers, sailors, and managers. Really quick, let's talk about the workers on this rig and what it was like working on the Horizon. On the Horizon, there were 2 shifts, each 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, with very few breaks. But in exchange, supervisors and technicians received 3 weeks off at the end of a 3-week shift, and everybody else received 2 weeks on and 2 weeks off. So, kind of nice little vacation
Yeah,
time.
like time and a half.
hmm But how much did they make? Obviously, we want to know about that. Drilling hands right out of high school made between $40,000 to $70,000 a year, which at the time was a lot less than it is now. Adjusted for inflation, that's $71,000 to roughly $126,000 today.
Okay.
Fresh out of high school, that's pretty good
Yeah, that's
money.
pretty good money.
And higher ups made closer to $100,000, which is about $162,000 today. The captain earned up to $200,000, and the OIM, or offshore installation manager, which was the highest person up on the rig, he earned way more. But remember, there was no union. Only company policy and a supervisor's goodwill stood between the workers and exhaustion. If the company wanted drillers to work 16 hours straight, they would. But back to the Horizon. See, she wasn't just a regular oil rig. She wasn't just a regular girl. The Deepwater Horizon was the first of a new generation of semi-submersibles that would be almost entirely controlled by a computer. Throughout the rig, a web of electric cables with sensors branched out across every surface, reporting back to the rig's control centers, kind of like a nervous system. Its sensors could register changes in position, the ocean current, even things like broken hatches, clogged pipes, overheated engines, and burned out light bulbs. Most importantly, builders of the Horizon boasted that this was the safest rig to have ever floated because its sensors could automatically close hatches to seal out gas-contaminated air, shut down electrical systems to avoid dangerous sparks or risk of electrocution, and it could sound evacuation alarms. I don't know about you, but I'm automatically skeptical of anyone who says they have the safest anything, okay?
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie. Like, oh, while you're seeing the nervous system of the whole ship, I'm just thinking like, all right, so if something does go wrong, it's gonna go wrong really bad.
Right? That's what I thought too. Like, we've all seen Titanic.
Yeah.
But Transocean, ironically, really prided itself on safety, especially considering that danger is a constant presence on an oil rig. Obviously, you're dealing with highly flammable substance like oil, inherently carrying risks. But the most common issues were actually kind of simple things like the loss of fingers, back injuries, minor chemical burns, slips, trips, falls, crane accidents, and then more dangerous things like hurricanes, blowouts, and helicopter trips, which actually was something that the crew was most worried about. Like, they were most worried about getting to and back from the rig, not while they were on the rig, because the oil rigs were pretty far out in the ocean, and the most efficient way to carry them from land and back was with a helicopter, sometimes a 1 to 2 hour trip. And every few years, a helicopter ferrying rig workers would go down due to a storm or even a miscalculation. Like, one time, a helicopter went to the wrong rig and didn't have enough fuel, and they barely made it back. In some years, this happened more than once. The worst catastrophe was in 1986 when a helicopter carrying 47 people went down in a storm and only 2 survived. But leading up to this fateful day on April 20th, 2010, things had started getting more dangerous on board, and it wasn't because of the usual suspects. I'm sure many of you can relate to this in your workplaces currently, but rig workers began to notice their teams shrinking and workloads increasing. Over time, this resulted in equipment on board beginning to falter due to a lack of proper upkeep. This was made even trickier because spare parts could take weeks, if not months, to arrive. The first major incident occurred in 2008 in the form of a flood. The Horizon had reached the point where it needed a complete replumbing, but instead of making costly repairs and further delaying drilling, BP instead ordered a patchwork replacement of the most corroded steel. But what ended up happening was an overworked engineer removed a small section of pipe identified for replacement, skipped the paperwork letting everyone know this piece of pipe was undergoing repair, and when his shift changed, the relief engineer that took over for him had no clue, and because he was really busy too, he just went on to other projects. Worst case scenario ended up happening, and someone opened a valve to this out of service pipe and caused a massive flood. They did get it under control, and the crew was actually back to drilling 96 hours after the incident.
It's not too bad.
Neither the Coast Guard nor the Federal Minerals Management Service, or MMS, decided to pursue an investigation into the incident, which BP was delighted about because it would have slowed down drilling, and they were worried that an investigation would point out other urgent maintenance needs that the Horizon had. They're in the wrong headspace here.
Yeah.
But really, an investigation wasn't pursued because MMS agents were also overworked. The MMS had only 60 inspectors, and in a recent 3-year period, they had inspected 30 worker deaths, 1,298 injuries, 514 fires, and 23 oil well blowouts. Which I'm like, so your reason not to investigate was because there were so many bad things happening?
Yeah, that seems completely backwards. I would think that they would tighten up because of all the bad things, but they're like, oh no, we're overworked, so let's just stop working.
Yep. But what did they do? BP added fuel to the fire. That's a terrible joke. But they fired the engineer that removed the pipe, further adding to the workload problems. And they fired the rig's captain because anything that happens on the ship is always the captain's fault.
Yeah.
In February 2010, another incident occurred just 2 months before the massive incident. The Horizon had multiple issues latching onto the wellhead. They mentioned a lot of technical jargon in this, so I won't bore you because it's not really important to the central case. But basically, the difficulty of latching onto this wellhead was described as equivalent to 100 times more difficult than attempting to lower a soda bottle at the end of a 1,200-foot-long string into a garbage can on the sidewalk from the Empire State Building in extremely windy conditions while you're wearing roller skates.
That's wild.
Basically impossible.
Yeah, that's wild.
Around the middle of February, when it became clear that the pipe section was seriously behind schedule, yet another setback for this drilling project, BP got antsy. But why? You see, before the Horizon was commissioned out to the Macondo prospect, what the Wells area was actually called, BP had commissioned another oil rig, the Marianas, to drill in that same area. But the Marianas endured several issues itself, including failed equipment and even damage from a massive hurricane. And it eventually became such an issue that they pulled the Marianas out entirely and brought in the Horizon. The Marianas had missed every deadline set for it, and it had used up half of the hoped-for budget. This put the Horizon in a very tight place financially with very little room to fail, which is why BP was just breathing down their necks. Time was money. On the Horizon, BP had 4 company men assigned and kept 2 of them on board at all times. Their job was literally to enforce BP's will on the Transocean personnel who managed all the rig's activities from drilling to maintenance. No other BP people were working there. It was literally just like the higher-ups telling everybody at Transocean what to do. So in February, after multiple setbacks, BP told Transocean to bump it up, basically instructing Transocean personnel to push the drill harder and faster. And can you guess what happened?
Problems.
The bottom of the well literally fell out. Okay, really quick, let's talk about mud because it gets mentioned a lot in this case, and it's not like traditional mud.
Yeah.
This type of mud, or what many call the lifeblood of the drilling process, is an oil or synthetic oil-based concoction containing barite or barium sulfate for weight, as well as various chemical additives to tailor it to specific uses and make it environmentally friendly. Eye roll. Mud would fill the drilling hole, preventing the walls from caving in from the pressure. It also served to cool and lubricate the bit as it was forced out of jets at high pressure to carry the drilling debris back up and out of the well. But the first sign of a kick, which was an unexpected and unwanted influx of reservoir fluid, oil, water, or gas, is often seen in the amount of mud that returns. The downward pressure of the mud has to equal or exceed the upward pressure of the hydrocarbons seeking to escape. It has to balance out. In this case, when the bottom of the well fell out, too little mud was returning to the pits. This indicated that somewhere, somehow, the walls of the well had given way and mud was escaping into the surrounding geology. This was also really costly for BP because mud wasn't cheap. You couldn't just get it in the forest and, bring it over.
Just dig up some mud.
Not that simple.
Yeah.
In fact, it cost far more than refined gasoline, between $200 and $500 per 42-gallon barrel, and those are like 2010 prices. To plug the well, they actually had to pump more mud into the hole, this time with thicker and stickier additives, but this took time. So between the cost of the lost mud, the cost of the replacement material, and the time it took to diagnose and patch the leak, they were already an extra 2 weeks late and at least $14 million over budget. Understandably so, and eerily enough, workers on board began calling this the well from hell.
You're listening to our new podcast, Evil Money. Every Thursday, we break down true crime cases that meet at the intersection of money and morality. If you like what you hear, we'd greatly appreciate if you give us a like and subscribe and leave us a review so our podcast can reach more listeners like you. Thanks for listening. Now back to the episode.
In late February, the crew noticed another issue, a hydraulic leak, which was reported to one of BP's senior company men, Ronald Sepulvado. Sepulvado was probably the most experienced BP man on board. He'd been working in the oil and gas industry for nearly 30 years, 20 with Arco Oil and Gas before it was acquired by BP, and 12 with BP, spending the last 7.5 years aboard the Horizon. Crew members generally trusted him to do the right thing, especially when safety was concerned. But when Sepulvado brought up the hydraulic leak to his supervisor on land, John Guide concluded that fixing the leak would mean pulling the blowout preventer, a safety valve meant to immediately shut off high-pressure oil and gas in case of a, you guessed it, blowout. When they had to pull that up on the deck, this would force a stop in drilling and delay their project for more weeks, if not months. Because the leak concerned the least critical element of the blowout preventer, the test ram, they decided not to go ahead and fix it. Instead, their solution was to turn the valve leaking hydraulic fluid to neutral and it would stop. Guide also concluded that because the valve was, quote, functioning properly now, he didn't need to report the leak to federal regulators, and more importantly, Horizon didn't have to stop drilling. All right, enter one of the main individuals in this case, not related, but his name is Mike Williams, a Marine Corps veteran,
Hurrah.
and the Horizon's chief electronics technician and a Transocean employee. He's the individual that Mark Wahlberg plays in the movie version of this case.
Okay.
Mike had been on the Horizon since the spring of 2009, and needless to say, he was very alarmed by what he found on this rig. As the chief electronics technician, one of Mike's jobs was to maintain the fire and gas detection and alarm system, but he found that many of the sensors weren't functioning properly, and the cause shocked him. Turns out, one of the system's alarms had been switched to inhibited mode, meaning it wouldn't automatically sound if the sensors detected a potentially life-threatening situation. Mike thought he was a hero. He thought he'd uncovered a massive glitch and was proud to fix it, but it turns out this had been done on purpose.
That's literally what I was thinking. I'm like, they did that on purpose.
Yep. The offshore installation manager himself, the highest power on the Horizon, said that he wanted it that way so that false alarms wouldn't wake up crew members in the middle of the night. He said that watch officers on the bridge who looked out for fire and gas alerts on their computers could make a rational call to sound the rig-wide alarm instead. Not only that, Mike was battling an aging computer system that would freeze sometimes out of nowhere, and this was really dangerous when drillers depended on the computers to monitor what was happening below. One time, their screens went blue for a few minutes, and in that short amount of time, they discovered that they'd taken a kick. Even more frustratingly, Mike finally convinced his higher-ups to order an entirely new system, new computers, new servers, the whole shebang, but they refused to pay for new software. And we all know, or any knucklehead would know, that old software doesn't run correctly on a new operating system. Interestingly enough, surveyors from a risk management company contracted by Transocean had recently shown up on the Horizon to conduct a survey. Their survey found that a significant percentage of workers worried that the goal to keep drilling was always put above the need for maintenance, forcing the crew to work with equipment that was becoming unsafe to use. More chillingly, half of the workers surveyed said that they feared that if they spoke up about any issues on board, especially things being controlled by managers in Houston, that they'd face serious repercussions. But Transocean employees weren't the only ones facing the heat. BP employees themselves were actually graded annually based on how much money they saved the company. The evaluation category for this was literally called, quote, every dollar counts and simplification. Like that was like a category that they were graded on. There was too much money at stake, and it was clouding everyone's judgment. By April 2010, drilling of the Macondo prospect had put BP $50 million over budget, with little to no sign of relief soon. On April 9th, they decided to stop drilling and temporarily abandon the well by plugging it with cement and installing a better production platform above it. When the platform would be done, they'd unplug the well and get back to drilling. But this wasn't going to be easy. The final section of the well that needed fixing was conveniently the most exposed to oil and gas deposits. They considered a few options to fix this well and ultimately decided on a long string approach, which involved running a single string of steel casing all the way down to the wellhead. The risk with this was that any problems with the cement job at the bottom of the well would create an open path for oil and natural gas to come all the way to the top of the wellhead. The only thing stopping it was a seal assembly at the top of the well that was not built to resist heavy pressure. When engineers ran this scenario through their simulators, the results said the plan was, quote, unlikely to be successful. But BP didn't care. This was the cheapest scenario they could come up with. Others would have cost an additional $7 to $10 million, world's smallest violin.
Right.
So they told engineers to figure out how to make it work. BP engineers finessed a scenario that if they placed 21 centralizers along the pipe, this would bring the model to an acceptably small risk of cement failure. One BP engineer, Brett Kakalis, pushed back and said, quote, this is from emails, this is quote, even if the hole is perfectly straight, a straight piece of pipe, even in tension, will not seek the perfect center of the hole unless it has something to centralize it.
Right.
And John Guide's response was literally, this blew my mind, quote, who cares, comma, it's done, comma, end of story, comma, will probably be fine and will get a good cement job, period. BP applied for an amended permit to run the long string approach later that day, and their application was approved by MMS just a few hours later. At this same time, a different risk assessment contractor descended on the Horizon to inspect the ship from top to bottom, interview crew members, and pore over paperwork. On April 14th, 6 days before the disaster, their audit identified hundreds of items that urgently needed maintenance, and more notably, the blowout preventer was significantly overdue for its 5-year inspection, which it would never receive. At 8 p.m. on April 19th, ignorant to all the red flags, BP directed the Transocean crew to commence the cement job. And I want to avoid not being called for plagiarism, so this got really complicated and I had a hard time figuring out how to word it differently. So a lot of this is taken directly from this amazing book written by John Conrad and Tom Schroeder. It's called Fire on the Horizon, The Untold Story of the Gulf Oil Disaster. It's a really good book. I highly recommend you read it if you want to know more about what happened. But I just want to say this is pretty much a direct quote, so it's not plagiarizing because I'm quoting it.
You're citing your source.
Because I'm citing my source. So the first step in the cement job was to make sure the well hole was clean and safe and the casing ready to adhere to the cement. The standard practice called for a full bottoms-up circulation achieved by pumping enough clean well fluid down the hole to push all the existing mud out to the top. This was critical to getting a good cement job, but BP elected not to do this, saying it was once again too expensive. Instead, they circulated just 342 barrels of mud before they began pumping the cement. When all the cement was in place, the drill crew calculated the amount of mud displaced, and it was a match for the full amount of cement that went in, what they called, quote, full returns. This meant that for now, the well's walls hadn't given way, but what they couldn't determine from that test was whether the cement had formed channels or failed to adhere to the casing, which would still result in a full returns result. The only way to determine whether the cement was solidly in place was to do a cement bond log test, which would create a 360-degree image of the cement, revealing any voids the cement had failed to fill. But BP saw the full returns and declared the cement job was a success. They saved $118,000 for the test and the half day it would have taken to run the test, roughly another $500,000. They bragged about saving this money. If they had taken the proper precautions, though, and had not been so rushed, they would have known that a few days earlier, a nitrogen foamed cement had been tested in a lab to determine how long it would take to sit under the anticipated temperature and pressure conditions that would exist at the well's bottom. The lab test revealed that after 24 hours, the foamed cement hadn't set. Just 11 hours after pumping liquid cement into the bottom of the well, BP officials ordered what is called a positive pressure test to establish the integrity of the casing. They closed off the well at the blowout preventer and then pumped mud down the kill line until 2,500 pounds per square inch of pressure, that's a lot, built up inside the newly cemented casing, and they held the pressure at that level for 30 minutes. If the pressure eased in that time, it would mean there were leaks, but the pressure held steady for the full half hour and the test was deemed a success. But the fact that the positive test was conducted when the cement may not yet have been fully hardened could have caused a new problem. Pressuring up the casing makes the steel expand slightly, and if the cement mix was still semi-fluid and not set, the expanding casing could have broken the bond between steel and cement, leaving a small but potentially lethal space that gas could pass through on the way to the surface. By the time the cement job and positive testing were complete, it was Tuesday, April 20th, 2010. That day was a celebratory day because 4 VIPs, 2 from Transocean and 2 from BP, were flying in to deliver an award to the Horizon for controlling the number of, quote, lost time incidents, which were defined as any accident resulting in a worker missing time from work beyond the day or shift the accident occurred. There had been no lost time incidents on the rig for 7 years. That day, Transocean also planned to perform their final test before abandoning the well, something they called a negative test, or taking the pressure off the well to see if anything leaked in, basically the opposite of what they had done the day before. But Ronald Sepulvado, the BP rep they'd worked with for years, had been called back to shore to participate in a mandatory training. Ironically, it was on what to do if a well was out of control. He had been temporarily replaced by Bob Kaluza, who informed Jimmy Hassel, the OIM, Randy Ezel, the Horizon senior tool pusher, and Dewey Reveter, a driller, that a negative test was not in the plan. The well had passed the positive test, so the negative test wasn't necessary. But Jimmy, the OIM, didn't relent, and eventually they compromised. And this was not a good compromise. In one drill string trip down the well, they decided to do multiple things at once to save time. They were going to do the negative test, they were going to replace the mud remaining in the riser by seawater, and they would install the top cement plug regulations required before temporarily abandoning the rig. To begin the test, the crew lowered a tube into the well 3,300 feet deep, where they intended to set the top cement plug. The tube started spraying spacer, which is a thick fluid used to prevent the mud from mixing with the seawater, into the well. The mud below it compressed, and having nowhere to go, it forced the spacer to go to the surface, pushing mud out the top of the riser into the mud pits of a workboat nearby called the Damon B. Bankston, which had tied up to the Horizon just that morning. After the spacer was in the well, the tube began pumping seawater behind it up to about 12 feet above the blowout preventer, at which point they closed the blowout preventer's annular. In theory, this would hold all the spacer and mud above the test area, leaving only the weight of water against the upward pressure of the well. If the cement job had sealed properly, keyword if, the inflow pressure from the formation would be 0, as should the pressure on the drill pipe. But instead, the drill pipe pressure declined to 273 pounds per square inch, and at the same time, the mud level in the riser dropped to about 50 barrels, which wasn't supposed to happen. It all pointed to one thing: the annular preventer had leaked and the test had failed. As the crew groaned about next steps, the pressure on the annular preventer kept increasing, as did the pressure on the drill pipe. But by the time they decided to do a second negative test, it was 6 p.m. and time for shift change. But Bob Kaluza from BP, who was supposed to be replaced by another BP man named Don Vidrine, I don't know if I'm saying his last name right, Bob refused to leave. He insisted that BP wanted both of them there to get the negative tests done. I couldn't prove that, but my theory is he just wanted to put additional pressure on the crew. Bob and Don proposed using the kill line, which connected at the bottom of the blowout preventer, beyond the seal of the annular preventer, but still several thousand feet above the end of the drill pipe where the leaked spacer was wreaking havoc. They began by releasing the pressure that had built up in the system. Based on their calculations, the compression of the liquid around the drill string should result in 5 barrels of backflow out the top after it was opened. The 5 barrels flowed into the tanks, but they kept flowing, and they kept flowing until 15 barrels had come out. When they closed the valve, the drill string pressure quickly rose back to 790 pounds per square inch, fell, and then built back up to 1,400 pounds per square inch over 31 minutes. The results were odd, but they focused on the kill line, which was flowing mud and the pressure released, all signs of a positive test. But they were wrong. A month after the disaster, they learned that 50 barrels of heavy spacer fluid leaked through the annual preventer and fell into the test area, and the rest of the spacer, more than 350 barrels' worth, had not been pumped high enough. The reason the kill line pressure fell to 0 and stayed there was not because of what was happening down the well. It likely was because the kill line had been plugged with a thick and sticky mix of mud. It was giving back a false positive. After the negative test was declared a success, the annular preventer was opened. The pumps cranked up and began again forcing seawater into the hole to flush out the mud and spacer that remained in the riser. They continued pumping for an hour, and as the pumping rate decreased, the flow from the well into the fluid return tanks should have decreased as well, but instead, it increased. The return tanks began to rapidly fill, but at that point, nobody noticed. Between 8:58 and 9:10 p.m., The volume of mud coming out of the well exceeded the volume of the seawater going in by about 2,400 gallons. The pressure on the drill pipe also continued steadily increasing, but they thought everything was fine. On the bridge, the captain, Kurt Kukta, was courting the VIPs, showing them their impressive array of computer screens and instrument panels, and introducing them to his watch officers, Yancey Keplinger, the senior DPO, or dynamic positioning officer, they were really in charge of moving everything, and Yancey's assistant, Andrea Flatus. One of the most important buttons on this control panel was known as the EDS, the Emergency Disconnect System. If they pushed the EDS, hydraulic fluid would go down a line to the blowout preventer, activating shears to slice the drill pipe and seal the well, disconnecting the rig from any disaster. It was known, though, as a last resort option because it was expensive and you couldn't really go back. Around 9:30 p.m., Mike Williams was in his electronic technician's shop speaking to his wife when an announcement came over the PA speakers about gas levels. Mike didn't pay attention at first. He was so used to hearing them that he'd grown immune, but he did take notice when they mentioned the gas was in the 200s, the cutoff for all chipping, welding, and grinding. It was not a time to be putting any sparks in the air. Mike was cutting wires, so he immediately stopped because he didn't want to create a spark. He was initially more irritated to have to stop work, but then he began hearing a concerning hissing noise and a loud thump. He hung up on his wife and went to check it out, and almost immediately, he started hearing a loud beeping blaring from the engine control room right next door.
Are you joining us from our other platform, Salary Transparent Street? Well, considering we don't have ads and are self-funded, we wanted to take a second to shout out our own page's resources. If you think you're underpaid, we have free guides, tons of articles, a salary database, and a transparent job board to help you determine your true market rate. Check it out if you need help earning and learning more. Now back to the episode.
At 9:50 p.m., Randy Azell, who had gone to bed after monitoring the first failed negative test, received a panic call from Steve Curtis, the assistant driller. Steve told him that the well had blown out. Randy asked him if they'd shut it yet, and Steve said Jason Anderson, the senior tool pusher, was shutting it at the blowout preventer panel, but something was wrong and they needed his help. He told them he'd be there as soon as possible, and he hopped out of bed, putting on his boots and his pants. Nearby in the Damon Bankston, the boat nearby, Alwyn Landry, the captain of the workboat, realized that something was shooting out from under the rig, and then it started shooting out from the top of the derrick. Mud came raining down on his deck, along with dead birds who'd been knocked out of the sky by the immense force of the mud. He went straight to his radio, and the Horizon Bridge told him they were having a well control problem and to move to his 500-meter standby position. Just as he began moving the workboat further away, he saw an enormous flash. A few minutes earlier, Chief Mechanic Doug Brown was in the engine control room doing some paperwork. With Doug was his boss, First Assistant Engineer Brent Mansfield, and two motormen, Terry Sellers and Willie Stoner. I like his last name. The control room was made of steel, with two windows and doors on either side leading to enormous 10,000 horsepower engines. Inch-thick steel fire doors separated the engines from the control room, but they could still hear the engines roaring meticulously. Except they could now hear a new sound, a hissing, like air escaping from a large hose. They all looked around and at each other in confusion, unable to detect what the sound was or where it was coming from. And then gas alarms started to beep, and the radio cracked with orders from Captain Kurt for the Damon Bankston to detach and move away from the rig. At that point, the hissing had evolved into a roar, similar to that of a jet engine. Multiple ESD alerts began going off in the control panel, and these only flashed when multiple gas sensors were triggered in a given area. Gas was not good. Engine 3 began to lose it, revving higher and higher, and Doug couldn't understand why two automatic engine trips designed to shut the engines down hadn't kicked in yet. He tested them recently, but it just kept revving faster and faster until Doug couldn't even hear it anymore, and then it hit ahead. Everything went dark, and there was a deafening bang. The heavy steel door between the engine and the control room blew off its hinges, slamming Brent Mansfield into the corner, fracturing his skull and tearing away a 10-inch long slice of his scalp. To this day, he has no idea what happened. He has no memory of this incident. Doug was hit with the force of a freight train, and I'm not sure if that caused the ground below him to open or if it just opened from the explosion on its own, but he actually landed on the floor beneath him in what they called the subfloor, which was where they stored all the cables and wires. As he tried to get up, another explosion went off from engine number 6, and he was sent back down in the hole where the ceiling also caved in on him. Mike Williams was right next door to the engine control room and had just gotten ready to open his door when the explosion occurred. He was just reaching for his door, a 3-inch thick steel fire-rated door that was affixed by 6 stainless steel hinges, when he heard an explosion and the door came off its hinges, slammed into him, and pushed him into a wall on the other side of the room. When he came to, the door had him pinned against the wall and the room had begun to fill with smoke. He pushed the door off of him and began to crawl on the floor to escape the smoke. As he got to the next door, though, that one also exploded and sent him back 35 feet into another wall. At that point, he says, he started getting pissed because these doors were supposed to protect him, but they were hurting him.
Yeah, like listening to these doors. Wow, man.
Yeah.
That's crazy. I would definitely be, I don't know, I'll probably just sit in a hole somewhere. But I meant then again, you might have the ceiling cave in on you, so.
Right. And he was kind of in a similar position, do you fight or do you try to go out? And he decided to make a decision. He had to get outside or he was going to die there. So he kept crawling. He reached into his pocket and found a pen flashlight, which he clicked on and put in his mouth, but the problem was he couldn't see. He had no idea why, whether it was blood or brains, but he knew he was hurt. From the multiple explosions, he now had a gash on his forehead that was dripping blood all over him, and his left arm and leg weren't working. But he kept moving forward, feeling his way through the hallway guided by his memory and touch. He came across a body, but he couldn't tell who it was, and there wasn't any movement. So he decided there wasn't much he could do to help because he was injured himself, so he had to keep going, and if he could, he'd send back help. He had unknowingly crawled into the engine control room and was now with Doug Brown and Willie Stoner, and they saw a hatch that had been blown open leading them outdoors, so all 3 of them went outside and took deep breaths of air. But then they heard Brent moaning back in the control room, and Willie and another motorman, Paul Meinhardt, went back to get him, while Doug helped Mike get to their muster station, which is their designated checkpoint in the case of an emergency. So going to another area of the rig, on opposite sides of the rig, crane operators Micah Sandel and Dale Burkeen looked on in awe at what was happening. Micah had seen the mud shoot out of the derrick and instantly knew it was a blowout. He was in the middle of yelling this into his radio when it stopped, and for a split second, he thought they'd gotten it under control, but then it began shooting out everywhere, and he knew it wasn't. Something beneath Micah exploded, and in a matter of seconds, he was surrounded by smoke and flames. But Micah and Dale's cranes weren't locked, so they must have felt that their unsecured cranes were a liability, and they began the very slow process of moving the cranes back into their cradles. Imagine being in this cab of this crane, and second by second,
just slowly moving it.
Yep. The seconds moved too slowly, and soon they both decided to abandon their cabs and run for the spiral staircases that led down to the deck. Micah was knocked down by a blast, but he got up and kept running straight for the lifeboats. But Dale wasn't so lucky. He had been about halfway down the stairs when a shockwave ripped the staircase off its hinges and plunged Dale 50 feet down into a cloud of smoke. Randy Azell was rushing to the drill floor to answer the control room's call and putting on his hard hat in the hallway when the explosion happened and threw him against a bulkhead 20 feet away. He pulled himself out of the heavy debris, but as he stood up, a cloud of smoke and methane in the air seared his eyes and choked his throat and skin. He dropped low and began crawling in what he believed was the right direction and ran into the electrical supervisor, Stan Carden, and a seriously injured tool pusher, Wyman Wheeler. They started helping Wyman when the Horizon's OIM, Jimmy Harrell, appeared wearing nothing but overalls. He told them he'd been in the shower when the blast happened, and honestly, that's my worst nightmare. Any kind of disaster happening while I'm showering or on the toilet, I'll accept death, okay? That's just me. But Jimmy couldn't stay. He had to hurry to the bridge while Randy and Stan pulled Wyman up out of the debris and started helping another person nearby crying for help, whom they realized was one of Transocean's VIPs, Buddy Trahan. Buddy was pinned underneath a steel door, these freaking doors, and covered in blood. When they pulled the door off of him, they realized why. One of the door's steel hinges had pierced Buddy's neck, leaving a hole the size of a golf ball a half-inch from his carotid artery. And while at first it appeared that he was wearing a black shirt, Randy soon realized this was his blackened skin, where his clothes had burned off from his belt to his head. He also had a long, deep gash on his left thigh, and Randy thought he could see the bone through the torn cloth and flesh. He couldn't understand how Buddy was conscious. They had sent Chad Murray, the chief electrician, to get a stretcher for Buddy, and they immediately loaded Buddy onto it when Chad came back. Chad and Stan took Buddy to the lifeboats while Randy stayed back with Wyman. Wyman couldn't walk, and there was only one stretcher, so he told him he wasn't going to leave him, and he honored that promise. On the bridge, Andrea Fleitas began seeing magenta warnings on her screens, the most dangerous level of combustible gas intrusion, just as the rig shook with a jolt. Her training had taught her that when this happened, she had to hit the general alarm immediately, but as everything went off, she didn't know how to respond. She'd never seen all the alarms go off like this at once. The phone rang from the rig floor, and Andrea answered it. They told her they were fighting a kick from the well, and then they hung up. The magenta alarms kept flashing as more and more parts of the rig began to light up until eventually all the screens turned off and the room went completely dark. A backup battery kicked on, but as Yancy and Andrea checked the monitors, nothing had power. The engines, the thrusters, nothing except for the emergency battery on the bridge. Like what you said, if everything goes out, you're kind of SOL.
Yeah.
Then they saw a flash of light accompanied by a massive bang, and Andrea instinctually hit the general alarm, grabbed the radio, and began calling over an open channel, "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday." Wildly, Captain Kurt immediately reprimanded Andrea for breaking the chain of command and calling a mayday, telling her he hadn't given her the authority to do so. Captain Kurt is not my favorite character, and you'll see why in a little bit. At the rear of the rig, Doug Brown and Mike Williams had made their way to their assigned lifeboats, but they found that there was no lifeboat deck and no lifeboats. Where there had been a walkway and handrails, there was only a ledge now that dropped off into the darkness. If they had taken one more step, they would have plunged into the ocean. They made the decision to leave the rear of the rig and head to the bow instead, where they hoped there would be lifeboats that they could get on. They made it all the way to the bridge, where they busted in and told Captain Kurt they needed to abandon ship now, and they needed to EDS. Chris Pleasant, the subsea supervisor on duty who was responsible for executing the EDS, went to do so, but Captain Kurt and Don Vadrine, the BP company man, stopped him. They said he couldn't EDS without permission from the OIM, and just on cue, Jimmy Hassel came running in telling them, "EDS! EDS!" They did, but realized it was too late. The gauges read 0, and the hydraulics they needed to EDS were dead. Steve Bertoni, the chief engineer, was also in the bridge and realized he could turn on the standby generator, which would give them the ability to bring engines back online. He asked Captain Kurt for permission to go near the derrick to the standby generator, which he granted, and he was followed by Mike Williams and Paul Meinhardt, the motorman, back into the flames. When they reached the standby generator room, Steve flipped the switch from automatic to manual, hit the reset button, and pressed start. But nothing happened. He tried again and again, to no avail. Eventually, they knew there was nothing they could do, and they turned to go back to the bridge. At the same time, Dave Young had left the bridge to go back to the deck. He was chief mate, so it was his responsibility to direct their emergency response and firefighting. When Dave got to the emergency gear locker, he found only one person there from his team, Christopher Choi. Everyone else had ignored their training and headed straight for the lifeboats. Dave tried putting on his fire suit, the padded fireproof pants, helmet, mask, and air tank, but he realized it was taking way too long, so he grabbed just the jacket and headed out to the deck. He ran into Chad Murray, the chief electrician, who told him Dale Burkeen was lying on the deck nearby and not moving. Dave sprinted toward the crane, getting thrown around by explosions until he made it to Dale. Dale was on his back, unconscious and bleeding, and Dale struggled to find a pulse. Because Dale was quite a large man, Dave was unable to move him, so he ran back to the gear locker to get Christopher Choi's help, but when they returned, the path to the crane was completely blocked by flames. Dave headed back to the bridge, where Captain Kurt had the nerve to ask him why he wasn't fighting the fire. He sucks.
I'm like, bro, you got to get off this rig right now. Like, I'm about to throw you off this rig.
And that's what he said. In response, he grabbed Kurt by the shirt, took him outside, and pointed at the flames surrounding them, emphasizing that they needed to abandon ship. On the deck, it was pure chaos. Despite all the safety training and awards, a stunned, dazed, injured, and panicked crew gathered around the 2 lifeboats remaining, screaming things like, "Why can't we leave now?" and "I don't want to die." The boats were shaped like booties and were fully enclosed with a roof to protect the crew inside from falling debris. The lifeboats were built according to Korean standards, so they could fit 73 110-pound bodies hip to hip and knee to knee. But this was America, and so they could fit only 45 to 60 Americans, considering they were much larger and some weighed over 250 pounds. Considering there were 126 crew on board, it didn't appear possible that there was enough room for all of them. Sound familiar?
Yeah.
While some tried to follow procedure and count the people there, loading the wounded first, etc., many were beginning to panic as fireballs swirled around them, and they jumped into the boats, bypassing any lines and creating even more panic. Soon, people began jumping off the side of the oil rig into the ocean water below. Thankfully, there was a rescue boat tied to the bankston nearby, so they immediately began lowering that into the water to go save the jumpers that were in the water. For what felt like excruciating minutes, the 2 lifeboats filled with as many people as they could, including Buddy on the stretcher, who apparently had the worst injuries they could see, and they put him across people's laps inside. Equipment and fireballs blazed around them until they couldn't wait any longer, and both lifeboats dropped into the water just as Steve, Mike, Paul, Dave, Captain Kurt, Yancey, and Andrea made it to the deck. They were soon joined by Stan Carden and Chad Murray, who had gone back inside with the stretcher to grab Randy and carry Wyman out. They had actually gone back for them. But they realized that all the lifeboats were gone. Luckily, they still had life rafts, which were essentially 20-foot wide kiddie pools with a tent-like canopy to protect them from things above. Dave took charge of deploying the raft, but as he cranked the handle lifting it, it got stuck on a rope tethering it to the davit. They screamed for a knife to cut it loose, but Transocean had a no-knife policy, one of its safety measures. Thankfully, Mike had some kind of electronic tool with him that he used to unscrew a shackle the rope was tied to, freeing it. Dave hopped inside and held onto the rig's side, trying to keep the raft in place, urging the crew to get in. He soon began to smell and taste burning rubber, though, and they realized that the heat from the fire above them had been met by an updraft from beneath the rig, and it was essentially cooking the bottom of their life raft. Steve luckily had his leather work gloves on. He couldn't remember when he'd put those on, but he could feel the intense heat through those gloves, and his knees burned as he knelt down on the deck to feed Wyman's stretcher into the life raft. Steve followed after him, then Andrea, and everyone else until it was just Kurt, Yancey, and Mike left standing on the rig. Right then, another massive explosion occurred, and Captain Kurt ordered Dave to release the lifeboat, where it plunged 50 feet down, getting caught on a rope designed to tether it to the side of the rig, flipping the raft from side to side. While everyone tumbled around in the raft, Andrea fell straight out of its opening into the ocean water, but as the raft hit the surface, she grabbed onto its edge, and thankfully she did because now the ocean was on fire. With the horizon exploding around them and no lifeboats or life rafts left, Kurt, Yancey, and Mike knew they had 2 choices left: jump into the water or stay there and die. Mike remembered his training. Reach your hand across your life jacket, grab your ear, take 1 step over the edge, look straight ahead, cross your legs, and fall. But it wasn't that simple. Mike knew that there were lifeboats and the raft beneath them, and if they jumped directly over them, they could risk killing everyone below. Remember, this was a massive platform. Even a crayon shot over the edge could become a dangerous projectile from that height. They decided they had to run for it, but they had very little space behind them, just like 2 or 3 steps. So they did everything they could to take the largest steps possible, and they flung themselves into the flaming water below. In the life raft, Dave realized that they had started drifting underneath the rig and were being pulled towards the center, which was completely engulfed. Dave, Steve, Chad, and Paul jumped out of the raft into the water to pull the raft away from the rig. As they kicked and swam as hard as they could, Captain Kurt plunged into the water 5 feet away. Then Yancey landed 10 feet away. But after pulling the raft a bit farther, they hit a snag and realized that the rope they were initially caught on was still tied to the rig. They began screaming for help, helpless as it pulled them back to the center. But luckily, a rescue boat was nearby and began racing towards them. With a knife, they cut them loose and brought them to safety. Nearby, Mike Williams had landed in the water and immediately felt his skin, face, and eyes burning. He couldn't tell if he was on fire or dead. He started swimming and kicking as hard as he could and for as long as he could until he no longer felt any pain. He started hearing a faint voice saying, "Over here! Over here!" And while he was convinced at that point that he was dead, he continued swimming towards it. Just as it seemed like his adrenaline had run out and his arms and legs fell like dead weights to his sides, hands grabbed around his life jacket and pulled him out of the water onto solid ground. He'd been saved. In the background, the Deepwater Horizon engulfed everything on board and blew up.
You're listening to our new podcast, Evil Money. Every Thursday, we break down true crime cases that meet at the intersection of money and morality. If you like what you hear, we'd greatly appreciate if you give us a like and subscribe and leave us a review so our podcast can reach more listeners like you. Thanks for listening. Now back to the episode.
By 11:30 p.m., Coast Guard helicopters had begun arriving to help search and rescue possible survivors and evacuate the most critically injured, including Buddy Trahan and Brent Mansfield. With all the survivors aboard the Damon Bankston, including 17 people rescued out of the water, Dave pulled himself together. He had to take roll call and identify how many of the crew were still missing. He knew Dale Burkeen was part of that list. Dale was 37 years old. He had a wife and 6-year-old son at home, waiting to go camping when he came back. They took roll twice. The first time, they identified 15 people missing, and the second time, 11. Each of the 11 missing crew members had been on duty at the time of the disaster. 3 were assistant drillers: Donald Clark, Stephen Curtis, and Wyatt Kemp. Donald was 49 years old. He had a wife, 2 sons, and 2 daughters. That day was actually Stephen Curtis's 40th birthday. He also had a wife and 2 teenage kids. Wyatt Kemp was just 27 years old and had recently been promoted. He also had a wife and 2 young daughters aged 3 and 4 months old. Dewey Revitt, a driller, was also missing. He was 48 years old and had a wife and 2 daughters. 2 of the missing were mud engineers Gordon Jones and Keith Blair Manuel, who were contractors on board. Gordon was 28 years old, and his pregnant wife was due any day now. And Blair, 56, had been planning a summer wedding with his fiancée. Another missing was a roustabout named Carl Kleppinger Jr., a 38-year-old veteran of Desert Storm. He had a wife at home and a teenage son with special needs. 2 young floor hands were also missing: Shane Roshto and Adam Weiss. Shane was 21. He had a 3-year-old son, and he had taken this job to help put his wife through college. Adam was 24. He was a small-town football star and had joined oil rigging straight out of high school. And then there was Jason Anderson, the 35-year-old senior tool pusher who had called Randy for help during the initial catastrophe. The tragic irony was that April 20th was actually his last day on the Horizon. The next morning, he would have been getting on a helicopter with all his things packed and headed to another oil rig, but instead, he'd never leave the Horizon. The Bankston was finally released from search and rescue duty at 8:13 a.m. the next morning, and the surviving crew on board began their return home. Over the night, the fire had not subsided, and the rig had actually started to tilt to one side. By 10:22 a.m. on April 22nd, not 48 hours after the blow, the Deepwater Horizon capsized and sunk to the bottom of the ocean. None of the missing men's bodies have ever been recovered.
That's wild.
And the really crazy part of it, too, is this whole time, they weren't allowed to call their family. So this was on the news. Like, it's 2010, it wasn't like a time where there wasn't active reporting. So their family members knew that it was literally on fire.
Yeah, they're watching, all the news reports, wondering if their loved ones made it or not.
Yep. And even though they had taken this roll call and they knew who the 11 were missing, they did not communicate that with the families until they had all come back. Can you imagine 48 hours and not knowing?
Yeah.
That would drive me nuts. But the nightmare didn't stop for many Transocean employees that night. When they got back to land, many of them were forced to immediately take drug tests and undergo lengthy questioning about what had happened. And for the families of the 11 missing, the nightmare was just beginning. Tracy Kleppinger, Carl Kleppinger's wife, had only received a vague call in a dull mechanical voice saying, quote, "I'm calling to tell you that there has been an explosion on your husband's rig. We don't have details at this time. You'll be contacted when we know more." End quote. And they never called back. Tracy turned to a lawyer who had previously represented the families of rig workers to try to find her husband. Horribly, MSNBC had actually run a story around that time that a capsule with the 11 missing workers had been found. So when Steve got the news that Carl was one of the 11 missing, Tracy didn't believe him. It wasn't until Steve got on the phone with the Transocean HR chief that they confirmed with Stacy that that story wasn't true and Carl was gone. Carl's funeral was held the day before Tracy and Carl's 18th wedding anniversary. The oil wouldn't stop bleeding until 86 days later on July 15th, when an estimated 134 million gallons of oil had spilled into the Gulf of Mexico. And the spill was visible from freaking space. Do you remember this happening?
Yeah, I remember it happening.
Me too. I remember seeing it all over and just, it was crazy to watch.
2010, right?
Yep,
Yeah,
2010.
I had just graduated high school or about to graduate high school.
Yeah, I think I was a freshman. The Macondo prospect actually wouldn't be declared permanently dead, aka sealed, until September 19th after the completion of 2 relief wells. So that's what happened to the Deepwater Horizon. But let's talk about the fallout. President Obama, gosh, I miss him, promised to assign every single available resource to contain the spreading oil and vowed to hold BP accountable for the cleanup. BP's version of taking accountability, though, was to spend roughly $50 million on an aggressive apology campaign, making TV ad spots where BP chief executives apologized to all affected, and blaming Transocean and all the other contractors involved for the entire thing. But soon, the U.S. Attorney General announced that they would be pursuing criminal and civil investigations into the rig explosion and the oil spill. The White House also pressured BP into suspending dividend payments to shareholders and made them set up a $20 billion fund for damage claims from the spill, as well as a $100 million pot for workers who were put out of work to the disaster. This wasn't related to the pot that they would get for being victims of this.
Yeah.
This was just for being put out of work, so more on that in a little bit. But besides the human aspect of this incident, the environmental impact was just as bad, if not worse. When the Horizon sank, it had ruptured its riser, spewing oil uncontrollably. BP estimated it leaked 42,000 gallons of oil a day, but in reality, it had actually begun leaking 210,000 gallons of oil a day. Oil even reached the beaches in Alabama, western Florida, and Texas, and tons of animals died. Over a decade later, they're still being affected. It's estimated that the spill harmed or killed, this is crazy, stand by, 82,000 birds across 102 different species, between 4,900 to 7,600 large juvenile and adult sea turtles, between 56,000 to 166,000 small juvenile sea turtles, 35,000 turtle hatchlings, 25,900 marine mammals, and a vast but unknown number of fish and coral reefs, from the great bluefin tuna to our nation's smallest seahorse. Researchers at the University of South Florida found that the oil had dispersed into billions of oil particles and settled on the ocean floor. Researchers at the University of Georgia then discovered a thick layer of oily sediment covering several hundred square miles of Gulf Sea bottom, and in some areas, the oil was more than 2 inches thick. Later in October, researchers found a string of oil more than 20 miles long at a depth of 3,500 feet, which had barely degraded at all. Unlike what BP was saying, they said that they had gotten 79% of it under control and completely dispersed it, and that was not true. They barely got rid of any of it. At the same time, official reports from investigators began to come out and testimonies had begun. The focus was on the misread negative pressure test, the malfunctioning blowout preventer, the faulty cement seal job, and the failure of the rig crew to recognize that gas was surging up the well. BP released a 196-page report of their investigation into the incident, placing all the blame on Transocean crew members and contractors. And frustratingly, BP recovered really quickly from the disaster, at least financially. By the end of 2010, so 6 months later, BP had recovered 2/3 of its declined stock price, which had took a major hit at the time of the disaster. But thankfully, there were some major consequences. In November 2012, BP pled guilty to 14 criminal charges, among them 11 counts of felony manslaughter and violations of the Clean Water and Migratory Bird Treaty Acts. The agreement carried penalties and fines amounting to more than $4.5 billion, of which nearly $1.26 billion would go to a discretionary fund overseen by the DOJ, some $2.4 billion would go to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and $350 million would go to the National Academy of Sciences. BP also agreed to pay more than $500 million to the Securities and Exchange Commission for misleading its shareholders about the magnitude of the oil spill. The deal was approved in January 2013. The EPA also suspended BP from entering into any new federal contracts in 2012, but that suspension was lifted in March 2014, and BP successfully bid on 24 federal contracts later that month. Transocean was also punished. In January 2013, they agreed to a $1 billion civil penalty under the Clean Water Act. Approximately $800 million of that amount was meant for restoration projects in the Gulf, and the remainder was paid to the federal government. The company also pled guilty to criminal violations of the Clean Water Act, resulting in a $400 million criminal penalty. And as for individual punishments, in November 2012, Robert Kaluza and Don Vidrine, the BP company men on board, were both charged with manslaughter. Unfortunately, none of them received prison sentences, including a few other BP men who were charged with erasing evidence and obstructing Congress. The manslaughter charges against Kaluza and Vidrine were dropped in December 2015, and instead, Vidrine pled guilty to less misdemeanor charges of pollution and was sentenced to probation, community service, and a fine, while Kaluza pled not guilty to the same charges and was let off scot-free in February 2016.
I was going to say, that's typically what happens. If one person accepts it and go, okay, well, that's one person we could slap on the wrist. That's all right.
Yep. BP finally settled with the government in April 2016, agreeing to pay the largest financial penalty ever made by the U.S. government against a single company, $20.8 billion. And what about the victims? 2 years after the disaster, BP agreed to a medical claims settlement, but sadly, this hasn't been proven to help most of the victims. According to AP News, and this is pretty recent, as early as this time last year, through the settlement, BP paid ill workers and coastal residents $67 million, but that was only roughly $1,300 each to most of them, about 79%, for the damage that they had done. Most of the 4,800 lawsuits seeking compensation for health problems have been dismissed, with no known cases reaching settlement. Why? According to the legal system, it's very hard to prove a specific illness was caused by chemical exposure. It's likely that we'll only learn more about this fallout and the effects of the disaster on our human bodies over time. For the surviving crew on board Deepwater Horizon, there's no question they've been forever affected by mental and physical health issues, with some of the survivors never being able to work or function at the same capacity again. And efforts to restore the Gulf of Mexico back to its natural state, or at least as natural as they can get, are ongoing to this day, and they anticipate that those efforts will need to continue into 2030. And today, in 2025, BP is still kicking and worth $90.3 billion.
And a lot of that could have been prevented if they didn't cut corners and try to save money.
Yep.
You instead end up paying about, $20 billion? And
Yep.
in return, when you could have saved lives, not had to worry about that, had actual function equipment for not even $1 billion. You know?
The sad part is a lot of people they interviewed said that they think this will happen again.
Oh, definitely. I mean, with corporations cutting corners to save dollars for their shareholders, it's bound to happen again.
Mm-hmm. One thing that really sticks out to me that I don't know if you caught that I mentioned in the beginning, but they had no union on board. They weren't allowed to unionize. So when I read that none of them received, any money for what had happened, their families didn't get any medical claim settlement, no nothing. And, their lives were ruined. Some of these men, literally their hands are shaking, they can never go back.
Yeah, the one dude who got a hole in his neck and
yep.
I know he's never going to be the same.
A lot of them are not walking today, and they have major health problems. One of them literally can't see. The gas, it seems affected his vision. It affected his memory. So when I hear that they didn't get any compensation, it bothers me because another crucial part of this is after they all got back, they all lawyered up. They all tried to get lawyers. But because they weren't unionized, they all had to go about this individually. It was them and their lawyers.
Versus BP, a $90 billion company.
Yep. You had 100 workers against BP, a $90 billion company. And not only that, their lawyers told them not to talk to one another, that it could complicate the cases. So they were really pulled apart from each other when that was kind of the best support system they could have had.
Yeah, somebody who actually went through the same process as you.
So it really shows, the value of a union, especially in a dangerous workplace, because a union could have gone to bat for them. But
That's terrible.
yeah, this one was really hard. It kind of had me choking up a couple times just because how sad and how young the people were. Like, they knew the risks, but it always makes me wonder, was the money worth it?
Well, I mean, like, I look at it as like, yeah, you know the risk, but they put all of these things in place so that you don't have to think about that, with all the warning systems, the EDS, all of this.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of the day, if your company's cutting corners, making sure that their bottom line is being met at the end of the day, and that's all that matters, then, like, yeah, you accepted a risk, but you didn't accept that risk.
Yeah.
You didn't accept the risk of things going potentially that wrong.
The ultimate price.
Right. I mean, as a firefighter, you accept the risk that, like, you'll be going into difficult situations, but, like, let's say your fire truck never gets inspected and you get on your fire truck and it blows up. That's a risk that you didn't sign up for,
Right. Another thing I want to talk about, because Deepwater Horizon, most people know it from the movie, with Mark
the
Wahlberg.
movie.
I watched it. I've actually never seen it. And so I watched it for research for this case. And have you seen it?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so let me explain to you. If you haven't seen it, just fast forward through this bit. But there's a big discrepancy. Obviously, it's a movie, so they take liberties, and they change the story a little bit. But I don't really understand why they did this. In the movie, Andrea Flatus. She had jumped onto the lifeboat and then been knocked out of the lifeboat.
Yeah.
Mike Williams had jumped off the rig. In the movie, though, Mike Williams' character pushes Andrea Flatus off the rig. They're technically the last two people standing, and she's too scared to jump off that he pushes her. And he seemed like a hero for it, for saving her life. And I don't know, that just kind of rubs me the wrong way. It's a very Mark Wahlberg, role
Yeah,
to
that's
have.
definitely a movie thing.
That's a movie thing, but I'm like, why'd you have to make the woman like a scaredy cat? Because in this book, Mike Williams was a little bit of a scaredy cat, and this is based on eyewitness accounts.
Yeah.
So I thought that was interesting. I don't know why they had to like change the story up
It's
on
probably
that.
one of those things like how, who is it? The Rock, who says that he can't lose. He's got that like written into his contract.
You gotta be a hero.
Yeah.
I mean, at the end of the day, all the survivors, at least the ones that helped one another out, I would consider heroes.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's the case of Deepwater Horizon. Hopefully it never happens again. But, that's what happens when evil money comes into play and people are motivated by greed to make really stupid decisions that risk people's lives. But thank you so much for listening to this episode of Evil Money. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss next week's episode, and stay safe out there. Bye.
Bye.